Welcome to this week's episode of Bird Brain. For those of you that have been listening for a while, you might recognize the dulcet tones of my next guest. I was absolutely delighted when representative of the BTO joined me earlier in the year to talk about roadrunners. And actually, I haven't mentioned this to you, John, because my guest is Jon Carter from the BTO. But you actually are my second most listened to guest on the podcast. And it's particularly impressive because my most listened to guest is prolific nature writer Stephen Moss, who was also my first guest. So he had like quite a hefty timeline advantage to you. So
Well,
congratulations.
wow. I'm going to put that down to the allure, the charm of Roadrunner rather than me, to be honest. I think he's just such a cool bird. And of course, we talked about cuckoos generally, didn't we? Which is also just such a great topic to talk about. So, but that's great. How wonderful. I'm very,
It is
very chuffed.
wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I record with quite a few different people, and you are the first person that, after a recording, has immediately sort of shot off a whole bunch of ideas for other things that we might want to cover on the podcast. And one of your ideas really struck me at the time as being quite inspired and has obviously stuck with me ever since because I realized that December had come around and that it was time to act on it. So, do you want to introduce the topic of today's episode, please?
Yeah, we're going to talk about what we're going to loosely call the 12 birds of Christmas. So we're going to use the 12 days of Christmas, the familiar Christmas song, and we're going to delve into it and see what bird connections there are in there. And there are many.
Okay, so for people listening that are going to be pedantic about this, they're immediately going to be thinking, you mean the 12 days, right? There's not 12 types of bird in there. So let's go through what birds traditionally people think they're hearing. So you can sense check me now. I'm going to try
Yeah.
and do this in order. So we've obviously got the partridge,
Yep.
then we've got the turtle doves,
Mhm.
French hens,
Yeah.
calling birds.
Mhm.
Then what have we got? Swans?
Geese first, I
Oh,
think, isn't it? Yeah.
geese.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are the geese doing?
Then
Are they laying?
they're laying. That's right.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
the geese are
I'm
laying.
not quite sure what they're laying in December, but they're laying anyway.
Yeah,
So.
that's true. And
Yeah.
then it's the swans.
Yeah.
And then is that it?
Well, that's it. Yeah,
Okay.
in our understanding of it. But I've read a lot about this, and there are very many different theories. And one is, which I found really interesting, was that each item is actually an item on a banqueting table of a medieval feast, and each one actually represents a bird species because people did used to eat an awful lot of birds back in the day. And I'm not entirely sure it's wholly believable, that theory, but it holds some water. The original version was in French, and it's been translated and retranslated and, kind of modified over, 150, 200 years. And so, we don't really know what its true origins are. So, for a bit of fun, we
Yeah.
can look at what those birds might have been had they all been birds. And we can throw in some facts around it and look at some of the stats around the birds and how they're doing today, really.
Amazing. So we've got a couple of gaps, right? We've called out some of the birds. We also are going to delve into how some of these birds, for example, calling bird. Hang on.
Yes, now that's a good one. That's an interesting one because calling is a modern version of what was collie. It was
Yeah.
Colly, collie bird, which means black, like coal. So it's probably blackbirds. And as in the other song about blackbirds baked in a pie,
Yeah.
what they used to do in the good old days was not necessarily cook the birds in there, but they used to kind of put live birds inside the dish and then put a pastry top over it. And then when they cut the top, the birds would fly out. It was a bit of a surprise, a bit of a kind of like a ta-da moment.
Actually do that.
Apparently so. It's pretty well documented that that was a thing, and that's the same as the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. That's apparently where that comes from. So it was a bit of a sort of, a bit of pizzazz, a bit of showmanship at the table, and the birds would fly out and everybody would cheer, and it was all very exciting. So that's
That's
probably what the collie birds refers to.
Yeah, and I love that because as a child, I had an illustrated book of nursery rhymes. And that is the illustration for
Ah,
that for
right.
me. It
Was it a
is the
ladybird
birds
one, maybe?
flying
Yeah.
out of the pie. Yeah, the blackbirds. And I always thought it was so funny because they really circled the words. You know, there were so many of them.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love the
yeah.
idea that that was a real reference.
Yeah, so that's quite cool, isn't it? I mean, but they were very much into their pizzazz and display, and I mean, it's a bit gruesome, but what they'd often do, certainly some of the bigger birds, like swans and cranes and bitterns and various other bits and bobs they'd eat, they'd remove the skin with all the feathers on it, cook the bird, and then kind of reassemble it and put the skins back on. So it was like almost like a taxidermy version of it. So they'd bring it out so it looks like a swan, and then
Oh,
they'd kind of take it off and then tuck into the cooked meat inside. So again, it was all about display, all about showmanship and
yeah.
medieval pageantry. Because these weren't regular folk dinners. These were kind
Yeah,
of
that's
these
true.
are these are big banquets in the kind of aristocracy and such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Regular folk didn't have time to derobe a swan and then Trixie
No,
decide to cover it back
they're
up in its
probably not allowed to eat swan either. There's probably
yeah.
rules around that kind of thing. Who's allowed to eat? It's all royalty and such.
We've covered the birds that we already know are in there, and we'll talk more on what species they might be. But let's fill the gaps for everyone else that's still probably screaming at this, saying seven does not make 12. And I really need to know what bird might five gold rings be, please?
Well, that's good. Again, I mean, having kind of delved into this a little bit, there's a theory that it's nothing to do with jewelry at all, and it's actually referencing pheasants, ring-necked pheasants, because they were brought into the country a long time before this song was used, and they were still kind of hunted, and they were still quite a noble bird, and so you could imagine that referencing those particular birds, and again, they would look rather splendid on a table if they had all the feathers and the tail feathers sticking out and all the rest of it.
Yeah, very
Yeah, yeah.
grandiose.
But they could also refer to something like, golden plover, which is also it. But I think that's probably a bit down the line. We'll come to golden plover in a bit. But there are all sorts of, different ways we could look at this because obviously they would have been relatively playful in the way that they wrote the song or the lyrics of it, and using kind of metaphors and stuff like that rather than being too literal in some of them. So I'm happy to go with pheasant on that. I think.
And so, where does that take us? Is it Lords a leaping?
Yeah, maids are milking. That's the next one that's not
The maids
obviously
are
a bird.
milking, yes.
Yeah, eight needs milking. Again, having looked into this, there's a couple of different theories. One is that they could be magpies because they represent kind of the maids with their aprons on, the black and white of
Ah,
the uniform. There's a bit of controversy around that because those kind of uniforms weren't introduced until a bit later on, apparently in
good
some
point.
places. So yeah, so maybe I don't know enough about that. But also the fact that pigeons, which were very widely eaten, and also famous for producing crop milk, which they feed to their youngsters. So pigeons, unlike most other birds, produce this thing called milk, which they feed their youngsters for the first kind of couple of weeks or so in the nest. And that
Um,
could be the link to milk, and there would have been wood pigeon and domestic pigeons on the table as well. So possibly that.
oh, okay. So we've substituted the golden rings. We've talked about the maids are milking, and now
Yeah.
we've got the lords are leaping.
Ladies dancing, number nine.
I'm
Yeah.
obsessed with the lords are leaping. I just want to talk about the leaping lords.
Okay, well, we'll get on to that very quickly because I've not really got anything too convincing for ladies dancing. Again, one of the ones I've come across is a theory that it could be cranes because cranes do famously a very kind of elaborate kind of dancing display in the breeding season, and they whoop and they kind of hop up and down quite a lot and leap into the air a little bit. And so if you were eating a bird like that and you were trying to kind of make it into something slightly more elegant and exciting to talk about, you might refer to it in that way. So apparently it wasn't very nice meat, a bit tough, but it was prestigious. It was kind of, if it was on your table, you had some clout. And there would have been more of them back then because they did become extinct at one point in the country.
Yeah.
And there's probably, sort of 70 or so pairs now breeding across the UK. So it may well have been those.
I mean, that's okay.
Yeah. But if you've ever seen cranes doing that, it's a really elegant kind of move. It's really quite dynamic. And it may have been a more familiar sight than obviously than it is today.
And
You're not
then
convinced, are you, Kelly? I can see you.
I was just thinking about why certain game birds really appeal to people. And I was thinking in my brain, because I was like, don't be really morbid, it's about Christmas, but because you can actually see my face, you can clock what is happening. I was thinking about how was that bird, you're saying that the meat was, maybe quite tough, not even necessarily that nice. Do you think it potentially there's just the show off quality of I caught a crane?
I think it's more like I have so much clout that I can afford to have these prestigious things on my table, even if you're not going to eat it. It's kind of a display.
Yeah.
You know, sort of a show of ostentatious wealth to some degree, and you know, it's very important, I suppose, as it is to some people today to behave like that. But in those days, it was very important because it was all about prestige and about who you could impress. I mean, and if you had people coming from higher nobility to stay with you or to dine in your home, then the more you could do to demonstrate your clout within the local community, the more impressive you became, and you'd probably get more from it.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I mean, I was in Vegas over the spring and
talking of ostentatious.
uh-huh. Well, I mean, it's a whole city of spectacle, right? But
Yeah.
I was at a pool party and, not really my normal scene anyway. And then all these cannons went off, smoke started rising everywhere. And basically this crowd of employees were carrying a woman on what reminded me of something, you would have once put on atop of elephants for like a sultan to sit on, maybe.
You got it,
And
yeah, yeah.
she was sat there literally to deliver to a table the most expensive bottle of whatever they obviously were selling there, so that everybody could be alerted. Hey,
Absolutely,
somebody with an ostentatious amount of wealth is here. I
yeah.
must deliver this.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah,
fully
it's the same thing.
grossed
Yeah.
me out.
Yeah, I mean, well, exactly. Yeah, instead of a bottle of extraordinarily expensive French wine, a crane did the same job, I guess. But by the way, while you're in Las Vegas, I hope you saw some roadrunners nearby.
You know what? I did not see a roadrunner in a
Oh,
national park. Bearing in mind, right, let me list for you. So we started off in Vegas,
mhm,
but then we moved to Bryce Canyon National
mhm.
Park. We camped there. Absolutely beautiful red rock formations. Then we moved back down and we went to Zion
Oh
National
yeah.
Park, studying. Went from Zion into California. I went to Joshua Tree National Park. We also visited Death Valley National Park. And everywhere in these national parks, there is paraphernalia that they're selling
Oh yeah.
with, you know, roadrunners on. There's warnings about roadrunners. Did we see a roadrunner in any of these
Oh,
national parks? No, apparently they're everywhere, but not in the parks where they say
all
they
right.
will be. And then we were staying in a Motel 6, and it was the middle of the day. It was really hot. My partner had gone to check something at the car and was like, Cal. And I'm like, what? Because we've been camping and you've
Yeah,
got
yeah.
showers and you just kind of want to relax. And she's just like, Cal, come here. I kid you not. There was a roadrunner stood in front of our door,
Brilliant.
our hotel door at the Motel 6. We are on a freeway. The Motel 6 is
Yeah, yeah,
notoriously like cheap, it's a budget hotel,
yeah, yeah,
single story hotel. It is just stood there. I get that it still stood there. It just looks at me out the side of its eye, and then it road runners off. It just trots down the full length. And I honestly, it was like the Pied Piper for us. We just followed it. We just followed it
yeah.
down, and it went round the car park, round the building, and then it just wandered around, and it was just amazing. And
Brilliant.
eventually, I saw the colors that it can display at the side of its
Yeah, yeah,
eyes,
yeah.
and I just had a delightful time.
Birds for you. Yeah, yeah, great. I mean, they are brilliant birds, aren't they? Anyway, we're going to move on. Your favourite,
Yes.
Lords of Leaping, which it's a bit like the ladies dancing. It's kind of a bit of a crossover. It could also be cranes for that leaping thing. But I did read something about herons. Herons are widely kept in captivity again for the table amongst the nobility.
I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah, they used to keep a lot. I mean, bitterns and peacocks and all sorts of stuff. And it was quite brutal, I think, the kind of approach to nature back then. It was
Yeah.
it was purely commodity. You can understand that amongst the kind of poorer communities where that's basically what they had to kind of eat. But I mean, yeah, it was pretty grotesque, I think, in the nobility as well, because it was, again, I say, it was all about prestige, all about showing off your ability to get these things and to show them off. So there's yeah. So what I've read is that because again, herons are quite stately, they're quite long-legged. They could fall into this kind of Lords of Leaping thing
Yeah.
when you see them kind of jumping up and down a little bit, and it could be that. But there's very little real solid documentation on this. There are lists of bird names that are on some of these banquet lists, but because the names have changed and because of identification problems, back in the day, they're not as accurate as they could be. So they used to call herons cranes, they'd call cormorants herons, they'd call the egret was a familiar word to describe most of those kind of birds as well. And so it's hard to know specific species by modern context, but you can imagine these tall, long-legged birds fitting the description of a Lord of Leaping quite easily, really.
When I was doing some research for this, I actually had to look at why it's 12 days of Christmas, which made me feel spectacularly ignorant because this is a song I've sung since childhood that everybody I know knows. And yet I could not recall ever having been told why it's the 12 days of Christmas or when those 12 days start. I have previously considered what does this mean? Because when we have an advent calendar, it's not 12 days long. It's the
Yeah,
whole
exactly.
it's
Yeah.
until Christmas Day. Did you know what the 12 days of Christmas actually
It's the
corresponds to?
period of Advent, isn't it, which leads up to Christmas. But I'm not quite sure how far it goes beyond it.
So I looked into this because basically it's meant to correspond to the traditional liturgical season of Christmas tide, which is the celebration after the birth of Christ. But then Thursday
Right.
is Christmas Day.
Ah,
And then it obviously doesn't end until the 5th of January. And apparently that is then 12th night because it's the 12th night
there we are
after
then.
Christmas.
Oh, I see. All comes together, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I was looking into that, and apparently the next day, which is the 6th of January, should actually, in that sense, be referred to as the Epiphany, and that's commemorating the visit of the three kings. So Epiphany was traditionally, for Christian traditions, marked the end of the Christmas celebratory period. I thought that that was really fascinating, and apparently it goes back all the way to 567. And apparently there was a council of Tours that decreed that this should be observed. It made me consider that it is typically it's normalized, isn't it, that we make a big fuss over the entire Christmas period, that we
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
lot of parties, we see a lot of people, we spend a lot of time being festive like no other time of year.
Yeah, it's interesting. These traditions go way back, and we kind of lose touch with the origins of them so often. And this song's a classic example of that because there are versions of this which all, they kind of each of the days represents a significant moment in the Advent. In the kind of Christian calendar, at least. We don't know what these things mean. The very
Yeah.
fact is they represent something at some point. And I mean, when I were being slightly playful with it, talking about it being kind of more birdy, but yeah, it just shows, doesn't it, that we just take these things for granted. We learn these things, they become part of our common culture, and yet we have no idea about the origins or the meaning of it.
Have you heard of the Christmas price index?
No, I haven't.
Oh, I can't wait to tell you about this. You're going to love this. In 1984, which incidentally is the year I was born, so obviously a year of important things. In 1984, there was a bank, and it still exists, called the PNC. And it decided, and I read from the founder today about how this came about. Basically, they decided to start this light-hearted economic indicator because it was generally a quiet time of year. So, what they started to do was they took this song, The 12 Days of
All
Christmas,
right.
and they listed all the gifts in it as market basket, a festive themed equivalent of inflation baskets used by economists.
Oh wow.
And every single year since 1984, they have updated the Christmas price index to reflect the cost to purchase one set of each of the 12 gifts described in the song. And they explain why. And they literally do go to actual sources. Like, obviously, they don't scour globally all of these. They go to set sources and get the market value and then they compare it. So I took myself to this website today to look at this year's. I am intrigued. If you could buy all the gifts for your true love from the 12 Days of Christmas song,
Yeah.
In dollars, what's your kind of guess about what that would cost?
I mean, are we talking about buying a turtle dove, or buying three French hens? Literally, or yeah, yeah,
Yes, the only things that you're not buying to keep are the people who they
yeah.
count as
So you're kind
people.
of
Now they're
renting them
counting
to
as
perform or
workers.
something.
Yes, they are
Oh, okay, right,
performers.
right.
Hmm.
Oh, lordy. I mean, I have no idea. I mean, I'm going to throw out a ridiculous guess. Through $7,000.
$51,476.12.
Okay, no true love is worth that. I don't
No,
think.
nice. And it's interesting though because they cite certain explanations. So, for example, the partridge in a pear tree in 2025, they valued that as $420.18. That is with a 13.5% increase on last year. So I looked into this and they said the reason you'll pay more is nothing to do with the cost of the bird. It's the pear tree itself, which has been,
Really?
yeah. So apparently that's been impacted by land, labor, and fertilizer costs, which we're seeing grow quite steadily in the US market. Whereas the price of turtle doves didn't rise at all. It
That's
stayed the
tragic.
same.
I mean, they've declined by 98% since 1994. So, I mean, I think they should have gone through the roof, the price of a turtle dove, because they're
Yeah.
so much scarcer than they used to be. It just
How
shows
do
how
you
much we
think
value nature, doesn't it?
Yeah, and how do you think they would have costed two turtle doves?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose you can buy captive birds. You probably just looked at the cheapest kind of dove
Yeah, well
price
they've
in
given
the pet shop kind of thing.
yes, two of them were $750. It was interesting because the more I went through the list, the more I felt like obviously this is a bit of fun, but it did make me sad because it isn't that fun when you look at it because the birds in their own right, they weren't rising in cost. The things that were rose the most steeply, could you guess?
Or gold, probably.
Yeah.
Gold ring, I bet that's the thing that's gone up through the roof, isn't it?
It's gone up since last year alone, it's gone up by 32.5%. I did like their rationale though. You can tell they're economists because they've said inflation and the federal rate cut expectations and a declining US dollar have sent investors racing for gold and other precious metals. So
Oh.
they've seen a huge impact on that.
Funnily enough, because we were saying that five gold rings possibly relates to pheasants. I guess the cost of pheasants has come down because they release about 30 million of those things into the British countryside every year.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're quite easy to come by, aren't they?
that's true. I think the
Yeah.
only other one that made me equally as sad as the birds not going up in value was the eight maids a milking. Do you know how much they quoted that as? They quoted that as $58 because that's tied to the federal minimum wage.
Oh,
And so that has stayed the same as last year. And that made me think how crazy that is that the people doing the work in the economy and the creatures that make up our fragile ecosystem are just so wildly undervalued that this list that is set up kind of in jest, but also is quite interesting, is actually kind of sad in this current landscape, to see
yeah, there won't
that.
be many of those milkmaids buying up the gold as the reserves,
Exactly.
go up in price. Will they? Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. It says an awful lot, doesn't it, about the where we are today, really.
But to bring it back to birds.
Yeah, let's get back to
So, obviously, while we're on the kind of downward trend, any of these birds facing particularly worrying things?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, turtle doves, famously now, I mean, in a really, really terrible kind of state, in this country. There's a lot of work going on to try and reverse some of those declines. Yeah, I mean, restoration of landscape has to come first, really. I mean, you've got to make sure that the place where turtle doves can thrive is in good shape, and unfortunately, it isn't. I know there have been some plans and attempts to reintroduce them, but if you don't get the landscape right, birds can't live there. Simple as that. So we've got to make sure that we work well with the agricultural industry and make sure that we've got landowners on board to try and improve habitat for turtle doves to thrive again. I mean, we know about them getting shot as well on migration,
Yes.
which is a big problem in Europe. But there was a 3-year moratorium on the shooting between 2021 and 2024, and the breeding population, increased by 40% in that short time, which
Wow.
demonstrates how quickly things can be restored and how quickly things can bounce back if indeed we give them chance. 615,000 more breeding pairs as a result of that 3 year shooting ban. Now, and we're on the western edge of that, so it'll
Yeah.
take a long time for us, our populations, to start creeping back up again. But if you could do that permanently, or at least for 10 years, or reduce
Yeah.
the amount of birds that are allowed to be shot or something, to allow them just to recover slightly, it's incredible how quickly these things can be done. It's up to all the conservation organisations across the continent to try and do what we can. And, the British Trust for Ornithology, the BTO, we're kind of monitoring all this stuff and trying to identify the causes and advise. And so that's where we want to keep going. And things like partridge as well, partridge in a pear tree. 92% decrease in grey partridge since the mid 60s. This is phenomenal. These are kind of birds
Yeah.
that we should take for granted. These are birds that we should all be able to see in the countryside, and they're just vanishing.
Well, I think the last time I saw quail was also in America and not here.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, European quail. I mean, they're pretty scarce in the UK. They're best of times, but I said, yeah, we just don't manage land for nature
no.
as well as we could do
This
collectively.
this is a good point though, because obviously for those that work in conservation or have got a very keen interest in ornithology specifically, they probably know what you mean by that. But a lot of people will assume that when we talk about land management, we just mean we need more parks or we need more green spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you kind of give us a couple of things that people don't realize but actually would make a big difference? Like, for example, when I think about hedgehogs, I know that hedgehogs need to roam further. So there was a big talk about hedgehog highways, like
Yeah,
people
that's
putting
right.
holes in their fences to make it
Yeah.
accessible to move between things. Like, that's really actionable. Now, I know we need big systemic change. I also know that we need policy, and I know that we need people with the most to be considering how they can use that to invest in a future that is more sustainable.
Hmm.
But understanding is the cornerstone to improvement, right? So,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
kind of land management things do people underestimate despite the fact they're actually quite significant?
We need to support farmers far more effectively, I think, in managing the land to be beneficial for nature. I mean, you look at the countryside and you think, oh, isn't it lovely and green and delightful? But actually, it's like a desert in so many places. There's so little in it. I mean, there's no biodiversity. There's no mixture of plants. There's no mixture of insect life. Ponds and rivers are just filled with all sorts of chemicals, and these things are being put on the land
Yeah.
to speed up the growth of certain plants for whatever we may be using them for. It's food, or whether it's to feed animals for food, or whatever. And so there are challenges. I mean, and farmers, they have got a job to do. They want to make a living from the land they've got, but we're not very good at supporting them effectively, or governments don't do enough to support them effectively to make sure that they can still make a living, still make a profit, but also not at the expense of the kind of natural environment. Things like gardens are becoming so important because they are, the more diverse than the countryside is, which is just
Yeah.
ridiculous, isn't it? They should be the sort of like the last haven for things,
Yeah.
rather than like the only place where you'll find hedgehogs. Because I mean, hedgehogs are doing better in suburban habitats than they are in the wider countryside. And things like ponds, garden ponds are probably, it's good for nature as some kind of open pit in the middle of a field that's got chemicals running into it all the time. So
Yeah.
there's all these things to consider, and it's about support, it's about understanding these problems, and things like we've got issues around the speed at which people want to build and reduce environmental protection on the planning and things like that. So we've got real challenges at the moment, which in the BTO we're not a campaigning organisation. We're about facts. We're about establishing facts. We're about research and science, and so it's quite difficult sometimes for us to kind of get too vocal about some of the challenges.
Yeah.
We inform the organisations that can hopefully kind of raise these problems. We're a non-campaigning group, so we very often I'd like to say a lot more about how I feel,
Yeah.
but when I'm representing BTO, I've got to stick to the cast iron facts here, which is fine. But I mean, I think most of us can see that. I mean, you go to some parts of the country, and it's the landscape's denuded by overgrazing,
Yeah.
and people. But think of that Lake Districts the classic example. Everyone thinks of the Lake District. They look at it and go, "Isn't it lovely? That's what the Lake District should look like." But you go somewhere like Haweswater in the Lake District, where RSPB and United Utilities are kind of working to restore some of that habitat, and you suddenly see what it actually should look like.
And
With
what is that?
with
What
lots of
could we expect to find there?
well, you've got different types of trees in there. You've got a kind of more diverse landscape. You've got more plant life in there. You're slowing down the acceleration of water off the fells.
Yeah.
And it's the same in Wales, the same in Scotland, and the same in the uplands everywhere, really. Where the kind of the bogs are kind of wet. They're not drying them out. They're not digging these
Hmm.
very straight channels to get the water off, and
Yeah.
so all that kind of promotes insect life, which the birds need to feed their youngsters when they're breeding up there. All these things are a knock-on, and we've got to look at all these things and assess where the greatest challenges are and try and do something about it. And we've got some species that are doing really, really well. Some birds are accelerating and colonizing and doing very well, and that's brilliant. We're producing kind of better wetlands. We're creating better habitat for some species that are colonizing from Europe, struggling with changes in climate down there, and they're kind of moving north. But then there are other species that are having a tough time, and we need to kind of be on it. We need to kind of keep monitoring it. And everybody can take part in this. We have garden bird watch
Yeah.
surveys. We have, wetland bird surveys, breeding bird surveys. We've got 40, 50,000 volunteers across the UK
It's an
gathering
impressive
data for us.
number.
This is phenomenal. Yeah, these are people
Yeah.
who just, they can do it for 20 minutes. They're looking out the kitchen window, or they can spend 2 hours out in a frozen estuary every month. It depends what level
Yeah.
of commitment and knowledge and stuff people want to get into. And this helps us get this data together, which we can use to inform conservation. So yeah, we can all take a part in it, and I think it's a great way of getting people on board, because sometimes it's just massive and it's staggering.
Yeah.
People can't, well, how do I help? What do I do?
Yeah.
One person can't help. Well, if you're one of those 50,000 people contributing data, well, yeah, you're helping.
You are helping. To pick up on a point you said earlier about the BTO sharing facts, I think in an increasingly divided world, it's very important that we do have sources that we can trust, though. The thing is with facts and data is that everybody else will get busy with interpreting those as they want. They will put those into arguments and pit them against other things. But it is really important to have sources where you can go for that yourself. I like strong opinions. I also like being able to trust sources and not being alienated all the time. And I think that's the thing, it is important that there are people we can trust that are doing that work. Even if at a personal level, it means you can't always shout from the rooftops what you want done with that, but it's important that the work's being done and can be used by other people. Seeing as we're talking about moving into a new year with 12 days of Christmas, have we got any success stories from any of the birds that are mentioned? Anything positive moving into 2026, or is there just an alarm bell that should be ringing even louder?
Well, the alarm bell is very, very loud, but we do have good stories to tell. There are successes. I mean, some of the work we're doing is demonstrating that we can turn things around a little bit. But things like, we've all seen the kind of increase in things like little egret, which in the 80s was still a rare bird in the UK. Now we've got over 2,000 pairs, something like that. Yeah, 2,000, nearly 2,500 breeding pairs in the country, and that's a rapid colonisation. That's great. That's a good thing to see, because some birds are able to kind of change the way that they live in order to be able to take advantage of changes around their environment and around them. So they're doing okay. We've got other ones like spoonbill are starting to breed here. And you've got things like glossy ibis, which bred for the first time in Cambridgeshire a couple of years ago, and we had a big influx of those this year into all different parts of the UK. So it's possible that they're going to do the same thing as little egret over the next 10, 20 years or so.
Yeah.
So it's not all doom and gloom, and there's lots of great conservation work going on, which is making differences. Things like the cranes and whatnot, which we've managed to get up, through some releases in Somerset, and then also just through kind of targeted conservation work in East Anglia. So there are some really great things. It's very difficult when you work in this world not to get too despondent sometimes, but we are seeing some great work. And things like, we did the Heathland survey this year, and mapping the changes in distribution and population of things like nightjar, woodlark, those things, Dartford warbler. These birds are actually, they seem to be doing okay. They're starting to change the distribution, and they're starting to appear in places where they haven't been for a long time or never been before. And so we know that targeted habitat management, creation of special protected areas, making sure that we're monitoring how effective they are so
Yeah.
that we can actually kind of make them more valuable. So there is a lot of work to be done. And there are some massive, brilliant developments in technology as well. One of the big things that BTO is working on is this passive acoustic monitoring, where we are able to record remotely the sounds of birds that are very difficult to monitor. But we're also picking up, we're also monitoring bat species within that,
Mm-hmm.
and small mammals, ground mice and things like that, as well as crickets and things like this. And so we're kind of actually, a human surveyor goes out into a forest once a week during a survey period. Well, they're only going to hear what makes a noise in that period of time, or they're only
Yeah.
going to see what's active in the hour or so they're there. But if you can do this remote monitoring, you're actually there 24 hours a day, and you pick everything up. So things like lesser spotted woodpecker, which is really, really, really declining, and
Yeah.
really, really hard to get a sense of how many there are. Well, I can go into a wood where there could be lesser spotted woodpecker and not see or hear one. But
Yeah, of
if there's
course.
one in there 24 hours, 7 days a week, and there's less spotted woodpecker activity, it'll get picked up. So we're opening doors that have never been opened before. And so there is positive stuff, and that allows us to enforce better conservation decisions as well. So it's a great time. There's lots of stuff going on next year. And another brilliant project we've got next year in 2026 is the Birds in Green Spaces, which is going to be about trying to get people who are not regularly connected to nature into their local public green spaces,
Yeah.
and tell us what's there, tell us what birds are there, tell us what animals are there. And this is people in urban areas, in suburban areas, and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully it just makes connections with people who've maybe never stepped into the world of nature surveying before, and give them a whole new kind of sense of what how wonderful wildlife is, particularly on their own doorsteps. There's
Yeah.
loads, yeah.
I went to Clydach, which is a little man-made lake up here. It's got ducks on it. There's a really nice established path that wheelchair users can use,
Great.
people with prams. Like it's very, very, like city park type thing. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of blue that can only be associated with a kingfisher when it is
Yeah.
that bright. And even, without binoculars, I could see that across the water it had landed. And there is just a thrill because I was there with somebody who's never seen a kingfisher before. I never have my binoculars on me, and I don't have particularly good binoculars, but they happened to be at the bottom of this bag. And I got to get them out and be like, look at the kingfisher. And we just got to stand there, and other people were stopping as they were walking past and be like, what you seen? And, they've all got their little handbag type dogs walking with them, and kids are like out on scooters, and there's a kingfisher there. And I think knowing that was really heartening. It wasn't just the experience of, oh, I got to see it and we got to share that moment. It was that, oh, it's here in the
Yeah.
beating heart of this community as well.
Yeah, and
And
sharing
you
that with other
wouldn't know
people.
that.
Yeah, it's magic, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I mean, a bird like a kingfisher is a belter for that, isn't it? Because everybody
Yeah.
says, "Oh, I'd love to see a kingfisher." You show that to a dog walker, or somebody with a kid walking by, and they're blown away by it, aren't they?
Yeah.
They are amazed, and it makes you feel great, makes them have a totally different experience of being outdoors that day. And it's just fabulous tapping into, because generally people do like nature. They just
Yeah, they
maybe just
do.
they're just not connected to it because maybe their lives don't work in a way that allows them to be. So if we can bring that to them, yeah, it's just gonna be loads better.
Before the episode ends, I realize there's a couple of the 12 days that we didn't get to.
Mm.
Shall we finish those off? Because I know you've got the research.
Why not? Yes. Well, pipers piping. That could be any wading bird. Pipers, sandpipers, so
Oh,
godwits, redshank, all that kind of thing. Woodcock, very commonly kept and very commonly eaten anyway, and still legally shot as game. But golden plover as well is an interesting one because that was widely eaten. But golden plover on toast was included at the first meal on the Titanic.
really?
Yeah, isn't that great? Well, not so great for the golden plover, but yeah, yeah, you could eat golden. Well, you still can. Again, it's still legal to shoot golden plover as a game
Oh,
bird. So yeah, so waders, so pipers piping. That sounds pretty plausible. I think
yeah.
that's a good one. And then drummers drumming, which is the final one. Again, could be snipe because they famously drum in the breeding season. They have this sound that they make with their tail feathers when they're displaying,
Ah,
and it could be
yes.
that. It could be that, or it could be woodpeckers, but I doubt anybody ate woodpeckers back in the day. So I think it might be more snipe.
Uh, I was at roller derby trading last night, and we generally we go around the circle to do stretches. And because Christmas is coming, someone said, "Oh, you can either do a stretch or you've got to share a joke." So I did a little Christmas themed joke. But one of the other girls came out with what you call a woodpecker that doesn't have a beak.
Banger.
Yeah, I had
Oh,
my.
hey! Look at that.
Yeah, see,
Sorry, I
you did
ruined
it.
your punchline there
No,
by
I
guessing
love
it.
it. I like it that you got it because I was there, like, concentrating really hard, thinking, like, I want to know this bird one, and I couldn't think of it. But you got it. So you are the true bird nerd of the show. You are the
Thank
winner.
you. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I have just had a lovely time talking to you, and I guess I should say Merry Christmas.
Yes, and to you and to everybody listening as well. Yeah, well, thanks for having us back on again. And yeah, and if anybody wants to find anything else more about the BTO, look on our website, which is just www.bto.org, and there's loads of information on there.
And I'll put the link in the show notes as well as the link to the index that I mentioned if people are interested in that. I'll put them in there.
Great.
Elliot explains. I know that this has absolutely nothing to do with birds, but on the 12th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 12 drummers drumming, 11 pipers piping, 10 maids a milking, 9 ladies dancing, 8 drummers drumming, 7 swans are swimming, 6 geese are laying, 5 gold rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.